Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. Poppy is spelled Poppie. At my website, you can check out my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet, or you can check out my book, The Ninth Hour. It is the first book in an adventure series. I call it a fantasy series, but that'll just confuse people. So let's go on and call it an adventure series. The word of the week is insoluble. Insoluble, which means impossible to solve. This is another word that I've heard, but I actually haven't known the definition. A lot of times you run into certain words and then you actually never learn what they mean, but you run into them anyway. Insoluble. Check that out. I think that I don't particularly like how the word sounds. It sounds more like something related to a solution, as in a liquid. Today we're talking about skinny writing, and my cliche disclaimer is that this might be short, but it probably won't be short because it's never short. That's not how it works. That's not how I work. I don't put short things. That's just not how I work. We're going to be talking about skinny writing, okay? And I don't know if people I don't know if skinny writing or the term skinny writing is a thing in writing, but I'm making it a thing. So if you want to steal this, if you want to use the term skinny writing when you're talking about writing, go for it. I don't mind doing that. But though you might not know what skinny writing means, I'm sure most of you know what purple writing is. Purple prose, actually, that's what it's called. Purple prose. And for those of you who don't know what purple prose is writing that is very flowery. Take the very late, great Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote in purple prose. He had a lot of extra stuff that he added on to his writing. Some might argue that that's the way. I mean, prose changes throughout history. And this idea of prose changing is something I push a lot. So some might argue that people used to talk differently during Shakespeare's time. They didn't talk in verse, though. We know that. They didn't talk in verse because nobody actually talks in verse. And the only people who talk I believe the only people in Shakespearean plays who talk in iambic pentameter. I don't know how to say it because I don't really know anything. The only people who do that are the royalty, not the royalty. What would you call it? The upper class? I can't think of the word right now. The people in royal positions. I'm just completely forgetting what the word is. So Shakespeare wrote in purple prose. If you want an example of purple prose, go to Shakespeare. If you want an example of purple prose, read older writing. Read writing from the 19th century, so the 1800s, because that's how it works. Read writing from the 19th century, and you see a lot more purple in your prose in that time. Not everybody did. Some people wrote very... it wasn't that they didn't write clearly. Actually, I think they did write clearly back then, but when you were writing, that was more acceptable, okay? But purple prose nowadays is the idea that you're adding a lot of extra stuff onto your writing. Think of it, the difference between Roman architecture. Roman architecture is they're the arches. Roman architecture is clean lines, arches, and then you have Gothic architecture. And if you want to, you can just go ahead and Google Gothic and then Roman. And Gothic architecture has a lot of extra stuff added onto it. That era, I believe a lot of art in that era so Gothic architecture is also stuff like the cathedrals. And I think a lot of art in that era was very... not cluttered. I don't want to call it cluttered but that's probably the best word to use right now to make people understand. It was very cluttered. There was a lot of there were a lot of extraneous things, or what we would see as extraneous, which I don't think is the case. Or you could look at illuminated manuscripts. Illuminated manuscripts were before the printing press. What people would do is, everything was handwritten, and the monks, because it was most likely monks doing it. Monks had a big part they played a big part in preserving a lot of written texts through the Middle Ages, okay? Because they were the copyists of the Middle Ages. They could read, they could write, and they went through the process of writing things down. But if you look at an illuminated manuscript, just go and Google that as well. I might just put one of the pictures up. See, the thing about me is I have to actually write stuff down to remember. So when you're reading an illuminated manuscript, what you see is that you have the text in the middle, and it's often in a nice script, right? You have somebody who can actually write nicely, like calligraphy, and then on the outside you have all these this artwork that just seems extra and cluttered. But there's good reason that they actually had that in the margins, and they were actually making. In some ways, they were making the book beautiful. They were each works of art, and they added those things in there. And I don't think we do that as often, and we don't understand it to the same extent because books are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and they're everywhere because of printing presses, first of all, back then, but also because of the computer and because of the fact that you can print a book in your house if you want to, which I think is very cool. It's going to be very expensive because each of the ink, I don't know, what do you call them? The canisters, the ink canisters, cost about $300 a piece, but you can print a whole book in your house, right? It doesn't have to be bound really well. It'd be nice if it was. You can actually do your own binding that way. But purple prose is it's similar to Gothic architecture. Purple prose is similar to the margins of illuminated manuscripts. There's a lot of what we would consider extra stuff. Okay, and before we go on, I just want to point out that different languages write differently. Certain languages might allow for more purpling of their prose, or what we call purple prose. Certain languages might think that is the way to do it. Certain areas might consider purple prose better than other types of prose because certain eras of the English language saw art as being something that was extra. It saw art as being something that was accidental to what we do. So it's more of an extra thing. It's something that doesn't need to exist, or there's parts of it that don't need to exist. So art is reflecting reality in a way where it's like we want to express something so well that we're trying to use so many words. We're trying to go beyond what is even needed. We want to be indulgent in how we use those words. Which my opinion on being indulgent in your writing is that you should do it when you're writing your first draft and just let yourself free. So different eras thought of art, different eras thought of writing differently, and different eras. And the main reason I think that people thought of art and writing differently is that there's different ways people use the language, right? There's always the basic way, but if you know a language better and somebody writes very simply, you're going to be like, well, I know this language really well. You can do so much better than this. There's so many words you can use. There's so much you can do. And a lot of poets, I believe there were a lot of poets in the 19th century as well, I think, that also did this. I'm trying to think of when the Romantics were actually present. So there were a lot of poets in the 19th century that did this and who added a lot of extra stuff. And there's a good argument to be made that people used to have a better command of the English language because of the fact that they had to use it more. You know, we do use the English language a lot, but if you just think about it, if you have no television, if you don't have any way to listen to music, if you have no radio even, what are you going to do when you're bored? Well, you're going to do more work probably because you have to, but if there's going to be times when you don't have anything to do, and you're probably going to do a lot more talking or reading, especially after the printing press came into being. So you're going to do a lot more reading. And I think that you're going to gain a better grasp because especially if you're a child, if you're talking to adults, or if adults are talking around you a lot more, and they're sharing what they know and the words they know, you're going to be probably better capable of talking to other people. You actually have to use the language to learn the language. You actually have to talk to other people to learn how to talk to other people. So I think in part it's due to the dialect, we can call it that, the dialect or the era of English, so Shakespeare's time. People talked differently. It was more rhythmic than it is today. What people don't realize about Shakespearean English is that the e's at the end of words, it was more similar to German. So German has words that you say, the e's at the end of the words, I don't know German well enough, but instead of saying, so if I had the word tire, right? In English, if I was going to say that in German, it might be tira or something to that effect, or tira, right? Because they say that e at the end of the word. With English as well, the English language sounded a little bit more like how the Irish speak, right? So think of how the Irish speak, and then say the e's, say the vowels at the end of the words, and you get a better feeling for how English actually was spoken, right? And you can look this up as well, of how English actually was spoken at Shakespeare's time. So it was more rhythmic than it is today. And there are certain words in Shakespearean English that rhymed that don't rhyme anymore. There's actually certain examples. There's things that Shakespeare wrote that we're like, well, why did he put these two in? But at that time, the language actually allowed for rhyming of those two words. And there's quite a few things in Shakespeare where he rhymes two words and they actually have a double meaning as well. And it's very clever, and you don't get it unless you actually hear it in that original dialect. So people speak differently, so they're going to write differently. But I think there's also differences in the basic ideas of people throughout different eras. So I think that if you are someone who is Catholic, you probably lean more toward something that cathedrals and Gothic architecture and all these extra things added on. You probably are more sympathetic toward that because the Catholic Church has a tradition of having I don't like to call it cluttered because I don't consider it cluttered, but that's the best word I can use to convey what I'm trying to mean. They have these cluttered pieces of art. They have these cluttered buildings, right? There's a lot of extra stuff on them. They have these manuscripts with all this stuff in the margin. So there's that tradition, that religious tradition, the basic ideas underlying how people work. And then there's another religious tradition in the United States, and I think this is probably where this idea of skinny writing comes from. Okay, and I'm about to explain skinny writing fairly quickly. There's this tradition of not having any artwork in churches, right? I think it's the Puritans. The Puritans didn't, I believe they didn't, but it's a Calvinist tradition. If you know anything about the history of Christianity, which it's a huge history. I think you're doing a disservice to students by not teaching the history of Christianity, because you're assuming it was probably the biggest factor. It's probably one of the biggest things in history that affected so many different things in people's lives and history as well. And it affected different cultures and different things like that. And people brush it over and they don't talk about it at all. And I think that's a disservice to the people who are studying history to not talk about Christianity, because it ruled Europe for hundreds of years, right? I would say that it ruled Europe for thousands of years in different ways, but the Catholic Church especially had such power in Europe for so long, and you can say that's bad, you can say that's good, but it did have an effect on the history. And you can't talk about European history without talking about Christianity. I think you can't even talk about Middle Eastern history without talking about Christianity, because they come together. You have to have that struggle between the Muslims in the Middle East and then the Christians in Europe. So the Puritan tradition is, if it is the Puritan tradition, I believe it is, or it might be the Quakers as well. But the Puritan tradition didn't like artwork in their churches. They liked their churches extremely plain. If you go into a church and it is or maybe I should say the Reformed tradition. That's probably broader and it encompasses more. It's very plain, and if you go into a church that is very plain, it doesn't have any artwork, it just has white walls and it has very simple architecture, you're probably in a church that is from that Reformed movement. And if you're someone who studies church history, and I'm getting my facts about that off a little bit, you can definitely correct me. I'm not above being corrected on that point. So if you are somebody, and I think the Catholic Church doesn't have as much power in the United States as it does in Europe. And the Catholic Church, there was even an argument of whether JFK should be the president of the United States, because he was Catholic, and there was this argument, well, if he's the president of the United States, then we're going to have somebody who is giving his allegiance to the Pope first and then to the country second. And there was argument about that. Of course, he did become the president. It didn't seem like he gave his allegiance to the Pope first and then the president second. So that argument was decided by the people who voted for him. But I think in the United States, we lean more toward this idea that we should not have extra stuff in what we do. There's this idea of elegance, and I think there's a lot to this. This idea of elegance is that you should keep on taking things away from your art until you don't need, so you take things away that are unneeded until you have a perfect balance between what you need and what is there and what isn't there. Okay, elegance is it's kind of hard to explain. Okay. With writing, I would keep on editing until it expresses my ideas without any extra words or phrases or even sounds at all. It has nothing extra. It expresses my idea as bare bones as possible, and that's the idea of skinny writing, or that's what I call skinny writing. Okay, but the funny thing about it is I think it came from this Reformed Puritan tradition, where they're like, we want to get rid of all. The idea was that they didn't want any artwork because it was a graven image, and so they were trying to get all these out. They didn't have any pictures of Jesus or anything like that, and they're like, well, we want to get this out because it's bad, it's not good, and I think I don't even know if they had music in their church. Actually, they do now, but I don't know if they did back then. But I think there's still vestiges of this in the United States. And I think there is something to be said about this. If you are a Christian, I think there's something to be said about it. If you are Catholic, I think there's something to be said about how the Catholics do things. If you are someone who is what would I call you? A heathen. If you're a heathen, there's something to be said about stripping extra stuff away. And there's this movement toward stripping extra stuff away out of your life, because when you have too much stuff going on in your life, it gets hectic and you go crazy. You almost go crazy. And it's like living in a cluttered house. It's like living in the house of a hoarder if there's too much stuff going on in your life, or if you just have to deal with too many things. And young people, I think, they lean into this. They lean into this idea of getting back and communing with nature and all these different things. In one sense, because they don't understand that nature is very brutal and it would kill them. It will kill them. So you have some of these young people going out into nature and they're dying because they don't understand that it's actually a dangerous place, or they're getting hurt. It's an issue. So they need to understand that nature isn't exactly their friend. But I understand this leaning into something simpler. This leaning in toward, I'm going to go live out in the middle of nowhere, and I'm going to have my cabin in the woods, and I'm going to have a fireplace, and I'm going to live without electricity, live off the grid. There's something to that. I like that. I actually am drawn toward that. I like it a lot because it strips away a lot of stuff. But I think that this is actually, this same idea, that comes from Puritanism, is actually why we don't like purple prose, okay? And actually why we prefer skinny prose in the United States. And like I said, skinny prose is stripping everything unneeded away. And there's something to be said about that. So before I go on, some of you might be thinking, well, is purple prose wrong? No, it's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with purple prose. Some people like purple prose. Some people like a lot of extra stuff. In the publishing world, I think there is a tendency to, if you lift up something and it's very purpley, you can always go too far either way. Okay, you can always go too far either way. It's good to be balanced when you're doing anything. But some people pick something up and they're like, in the publishing industry, I think there's a bias against it, where they pick something up, they read it, they're like, no way, too purple, I don't like it at all. And the reason why I don't think there's anything wrong with it, I think that it's just better to have a balanced approach to things, is that people used to write in a way that was purpler. Is that even a word? More purple? Is it more purple or purpler? I have no idea. But people are more against it now. All right. People like thin writing. People like skinny writing. Thin, skinny, I don't know which is the best way. And like I said, it comes from, I believe it comes from that Puritan tradition, and the Puritan tradition is the Puritan tradition is very hard to say. It's like the bedrock that the United States is based off of, right? It's this Reformed Puritan, not Catholic tradition, the Protestant tradition that eschews all this extra stuff. It does want that simple life. It's going to build a church that has white walls. It's not going to have any art in it. And if you have that culture underneath everything and you build up and you start to look at writing, you look at it, you're like, well, should writing have all this extra stuff? Besides that, I think that skinny prose, writing skinny comes from this idea that people in the history of the United States really had to live really simply. They didn't have as much time for extra stuff. So maybe the writing is reflective of how people also lived in the United States. If you're someone who, even if you aren't moving all the way out to Oregon, right?Maybe you're moving out to where I live. Maybe you're moving to Wisconsin. You don't live in the same way that people do out east, right? You live a lot simpler, and a lot of people were going out and becoming pioneers. And if you read something like Little House on the Prairie, they were becoming pioneers. They were around only their family. And that could have changed how the language worked, and that could have changed the fact that people didn't need to use flowery language. They could have spoken in a way that was simpler. I don't think it's worse that they speak in a simpler way. I just think it's a different way of communicating. But there is a qualitative difference between English writers and of the same eras. So look at English and American contemporaries. If you look at Ernest Hemingway and you look at an English writer of the same era, you're going to have a writer that is writing differently because the language is different. But I think that Ernest Hemingway is tapping into this American frontier psyche that people share in the United States, where it's like, and I think this still exists today, where people are connected to that frontier spirit. You may live in a big city, you may not think this at all, but if you live in a smaller area, I think people do have that sense. They do want to be left alone. They do want to be independent. There are so many people in the United States. I believe there are so many people in the United States who would love to be in a wagon train, go out where nobody is, establish a farm. And when they establish a farm, they're living off the land. They're figuring it out for themselves, or working toward the future. I'm sure there's a lot of people who sympathize. I think that people who are trying to live off the grid are trying to do that in some sense. They're trying to be self-sufficient. I think there's a lot of people who also do it in another way. They prep. They're like doomsday preppers. I think that's the same idea. Do you see doomsday preppers in Europe? I don't know the answer to that question. I actually want to know now. But it seems like most doomsday preppers live in the United States, which I think connects back to that idea. Another reason why writing skinny exists is because our language, I think, is thinner than it used to be. And I talked about this a little bit, but I think it's also thinner than other English-speaking languages, especially the mother country of England. I think the language in the United States is thinner than England. And I think our writing is reflective of that. But I think it's a misunderstanding of the purpose of what has been written to rely solely on skinny writing. I think to say, get rid of purple prose, get rid of anything extra, strip that writing down until it is bare. I think that if that's the way you write. I think it's, you have the right to do that, of course. I think that you should step back maybe if you write that way. You're like, I'm going to strip down everything that's unneeded. I'm going to strip it down to the skeletal frame of writing. And I'm going to keep what I have left. If you do that, I think you misunderstand the purpose of what has been written. Or if you assess books based on whether the person did that or not, I think that you aren't taking into account all sides. Because writing isn't just creative writing. Okay, I have to say creative writing. Creative writing isn't just communicating an idea. Creative writing is more than communicating an idea. It's to convey something more complex. Creative writing is to communicate a experience. Okay, it's to communicate an experience. It's conveying an idea, word by word, line by line, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. But after you put together all those sentences, the words, the sentences, the paragraphs, the chapters, what you get is this cloud of experience that somebody is trying to convey. And if you write and you're only going to write skinny prose, if you're only going to write skinny prose, you may have missed what you're trying to convey. If you're only going to write purple prose, you may have missed what you're trying to convey. The intention, the overall experience that you're trying to convey is what is going to rule how you write specifically. There's going to be the thing about writing, the thing about creative writing is you're not just conveying one experience too, right? If you're conveying a story, you're conveying experience, couched in experience, and then you have this whole entire story that is itself an experience. And you really need to assess what is going to do that best. And it's going to be context driven. It's going to be based on what is, it's going to be based on what you're writing and what emotions you're trying to convey, what ideas you're trying to convey, how the story is coming across, what images you're trying to convey. It's going to depend on that. It's going to depend on the characters you're trying to convey. And I think this is where it comes down to, I think this is where it's the most important. The characters you're trying to convey, especially in storytelling, I think are the most important things in the story. There's a lot of things that make a story work. I don't think characters are the only thing that makes a story work, but I think that the characters you're trying to convey are what's most important, because that's what people are connecting to. People are seeing the change in the characters. The most complex thing in your story probably should be you might have different intentions about why you're writing a book, but if you're trying to write a story that's really connecting to people, I think the characters should be the things that are connecting most of the people. And some characters are best expressed through purple prose. Some characters are best expressed through skinny prose. Most characters, I'm assuming, are probably a mix of both and are probably more complex, right? If you're writing from first person, then I think it takes more thought, because you have to get into the mind of that character. And one character might actually write very purple, and one character might actually write very skinny. One character might not use the English language correctly, but it is correct to write the English language incorrectly for that character. So when you approach a piece of writing, and I guess this is kind of my philosophy in general with writing, is that you're always looking at the context, you're always looking at what is trying to be conveyed, but you're also taking that middle ground. You're trying to look at it from all sides, right? That is the work of someone trying to do writing or any type of art. They're not trying to get bound to their own set of ideas. They're not trying to get bound to their own ideology. They're not trying to get bound to their own political viewpoint. They're trying to look at a broader picture. They're trying to actually express the world as it is. And the world is an extremely complex place, and you can't answer it with one sentence. You can't answer questions that are placed by the world simply. You really need to take it on wholesale, and that's why some of the greatest works of art and some of the greatest works of literature are complex. They don't give us clear answers because the world doesn't give us clear answers. And these people have been able to tap into reality so well, they've been able to express reality so well that reality isn't giving us clear answers. Congratulations, you got to the end of my podcast. So you either had to listen to my voice, or you had to listen to my voice and watch my face, which I don't envy you. Let's just say that. But if you're someone who likes this podcast and you're thinking, I'd like to support him in this podcast or the other creative things he's doing, creative things I'm doing, there's a few things you can do, because some people don't know what they can do to support people who create stuff. So these are the few things you can do that will really, really help me. First of all, check out my website. Check out the other things I'm doing. Second, comment on things, share them, like them, subscribe. Subscribe if you haven't already. And the third thing you can do is give reviews on different places, all right? So the biggest thing for this podcast is going on to iTunes, giving it an honest review, telling people why you like it, telling people why you hate my voice, why you hate my face, but telling people why they should really check it out, despite the fact that I have so many failings in terms of looks and voice. Other than that, if you want to check out my books, grab a copy of the book and listen to the serialized novel. Give digital copies away. That's a really big thing too. I always want to give you something that is valuable to you. I always want to give someone listening to this podcast something that's going to stick with them, or a book that they can actually own. And you can own that book for very, very cheap. So go check that out on Amazon. The different things I said: subscribe, upvote, comment, share, and definitely give it a review on iTunes. All right, as always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.
3, 4.